Hello, everybody, and welcome here to Cloud Builder Live, our episode for August. I am excited about what we've got going on tonight. We're going to be diving in. We're going to be taking a look at Kubernetes on AWS, and we're going to see how you can go through and take your first step in terms of diving in and actually deploying a microservice. So it's going to be pretty action-packed. We got a lot of things to get to. And if it's your first time joining us, I just want to really quickly level set on what this show is for. So this show is designed to help you actually build real solutions in the cloud instead of just knowing about cloud services. Now, I know a lot of you, again, you've achieved certifications, you've studied through maybe ACG or Pluralsight, or you've gained some cloud knowledge, but you're really struggling with how to put it together or the kind of work you would actually do in a real job. So that's what we're going to be diving in and taking a look at here in this series. Now, we cover AWS, Azure, and GCP. So check in each month to see what the topic is, to see if you want to join in and dive in and understand more. Now, we've already had some great discussion going on in the comments. And so what I want to do is I want to hear from you guys as we get ready to dive into this topic. I want to hear from all of you. First of all, where you're from. I also want to hear if you've had a chance to do anything with Kubernetes before, or if this is the first time. So be sure to go ahead and enter that into the comments, because I want to get a good understanding of where everybody's at, where people are joining in from, and as well as what you're looking to get out of what we're talking about today. So that's what we're going to be doing here to get started. So be sure you're including that in the comments, and then I'm going to start diving in. So let me start here by just setting this up, because I realize a lot of you, if you're coming in here, you might already have an understanding of Kubernetes, but again, I also get it. There could be some of you that join, you've just heard the term and you don't really know what it is. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here at the beginning, giving a little bit of a background, but then after that, we're going to be diving in and really making this work on AWS. So let me go ahead and give a bit of an overview here. So with this, when we're talking about Kubernetes, what we're talking about, it is an open source system for automating deployment, scaling, and management of containerized applications. So there's a lot of different ways to do this when you're dealing with containerized applications. Kubernetes has become the most common standard for how you actually deploy those applications and make them available and manage the entire process of, in essence, orchestrating those containers. And we've seen that there's offerings for Kubernetes on all of the major cloud providers, and even some of the ones that are not major cloud providers. Pretty much everybody has some type of service to run things on Kubernetes, but you also have the ability to run it locally, to set up a dev environment. But sometimes making the leap into the cloud with Kubernetes can present some challenges. So we're going to dive in and really understand that. Now, here's where I have to give a bit of a warning, right? I have to give you a warning that if you're going to follow along, there's something that you need to understand. So, and that's this. Just like with any infrastructure in the cloud, here, if you deploy infrastructure and you don't delete it, you could end up with some cloud charges that you didn't intend to have if you're running on your own account. Now, maybe you're running on a sandbox account and this isn't a concern for you, but what I want to really reiterate here is if you're following along and maybe you're just watching for now, but you're going to go back and watch the video again, be sure that you watch all the way to the end, to the point where I delete the infrastructure that I set up. And I'm calling this out because more than maybe some of the serverless infrastructure we've looked at in the past, when we're dealing with actual EC2 instances that'll get launched like we're going to do here in this episode, there could be some more charges that get associated with it. So I'm just telling you that going into it. Again, I will tell you completely how to delete the infrastructure that I deploy in this episode, but I wanted to be sure that you had a note of that. Now, let's get into some of the fun stuff here. Let's talk at a high level what Kubernetes really is. And there's some terms that you need to know. So if you fully deploy Kubernetes, you're going to see several things. You're going to have kind of this control plane, and this is what's going to be managed by, in our case, the EKS service on AWS. And so this control plane can really manages it, puts out the API, it manages all of the infrastructure around being able to deploy your pods onto your nodes. But then you have a whole other section, which is your node group. And here, this is where you actually can deploy the applications that you create, your containerized applications. You can deploy them out into your node group. So this matters because you'll need to understand those different concepts as we go throughout what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we'll have our control plane, we'll have our node groups, and then our applications will get deployed as pods onto our node groups. And then ultimately we expose those applications. If we need to expose them out to the public, we're going to expose them as something called a service. Now, with all of that said, we need to have another conversation, because what I want you to understand is that there's not just one way to deploy containers on AWS. A matter of fact, there are a lot of them. So let's just kind of talk through this really quick so you understand what I mean by this. So first of all, let's just look at this as a spectrum, okay? So over on the far left-hand side of this spectrum, we're going to have a service called Lambda. Now, you might not know this, even if you've heard about Lambda, but Lambda actually does let you deploy a container. So if you deploy a container out to Lambda, it will actually manage all of that for you. If it needs to spin up a new instance for a scaling event, right, it will actually be able to do that all within Lambda. You don't have to manage any of that for you. So this becomes a very easy way to do it. But again, you have to manage a little bit more because you have to maintain your container than you would just using Lambda by default. Now, the next one that we have here is we have a service called App Runner. Now, if you really just want to deploy one container and you don't have a ton of complex needs, really App Runner is a great place to start. This is a service that's designed to make it super easy to be able to deploy a containerized application. And we're seeing this kind of service pop up amongst all of the different cloud providers in different ways. But it's basically, hey, how can I deploy a containerized application without knowing Kubernetes? And this is where we get a service like App Runner. But then we can move a little bit further down the spectrum. We can get here to a service called Fargate. Now, Fargate also enables you to deploy containers. All the options I'm going to review right now do. But what it does is it gives you a lot of configuration, but you don't have to manage all of those underlying instances that your service is actually running on. So this becomes really advantageous as maybe a first stop for your organization in looking to deploy containerized applications. But then we can move up to other services. We have one called ECS. And this is really, AWS built something that was kind of Kubernetes-like, and this is what brought ECS. But then we also do have EKS, which enables us to run Kubernetes, but then you can deploy both with Fargate for those underlying instances and with EC2. And I know this is confusing because there's a lot of different moving parts here. Here's what I want you to get out of this, though. You don't have to know and understand all of these services. You really don't. What you need to understand, though, is this is a spectrum. And this is going to show you that the further you go to the right here, you're going to have more risk in terms of what you're going to have to own. And you're also going to have more maintenance that you ultimately have to own, right? Very little maintenance involved when you're looking at Lambda and App Runner. But if you're dealing with Kubernetes, you're going to have to go through the process of making sure everything stays updated. You're going to make sure that you're following best practices for things like how you handle deployments and how you deal with secrets. And some of these things are just built in to the other services. And again, you can do all of these things with Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is the kind of the Swiss Army knife that enables you to do pretty much anything you can imagine. But you do have to own and understand a little bit more. So why do I bring this up? Well, I think this is important because you need to understand that Kubernetes is a very, very powerful tool, but it's not the best tool for every single use case. So what I tell everybody, what I tell my clients, you need to make sure you're using the right tool for whatever use case you have. Now, here's what I'll tell you too, as developers, you can't go wrong with having Kubernetes experience. I think it's something that if you're working in the cloud, maybe you're a DevOps engineer, maybe you're a full stack developer, whatever role you're in, I think it makes sense to have Kubernetes experience kind of on your resume. It's something that you need to know and you need to understand because it is the most popular container orchestration solution that exists currently. So again, dive in and learn it. But here's another note that I just want to call out here is that when you're working with Kubernetes, you're not going to be doing things entirely the AWS way. So for example, if you have dealt with maybe Lambda, you've done some of the serverless stuff we've done here, and you know that, well, to manage permissions on AWS, I use IAM, right? Identity and Access Management. Well, you kind of use IAM when you're dealing with EKS, which is their Kubernetes service, but you also have to rely on the built-in access and identity management that's actually built into Kubernetes. So this is an example of how you kind of have to do things both ways when you're dealing with EKS. And you'll see some of that as we go through, but I'm going to try to shield you from a lot of that. And the reason is because our goal here, because I just wanted to level set in the beginning, I want to deploy an HTTP API, microservice to Kubernetes with EKS. And I want to verify that it's accessible as a public endpoint over HTTP, right? So this is something that we can actually fully achieve within the time that we have here for this episode. And I've only done a little bit of prep work to make sure we can get it done on time. And I'll tell you what that is when we get a little bit closer. Okay, so a couple things. Last slide. For those of you that are tired of slides and you're ready to start building, we're almost done. So the prerequisites that we have here for this, if you want to follow along, and again, I would recommend just watch for now, and then you can go back and watch the video on YouTube and follow along. First, you will need to have an AWS account, whether that's your own or whether that is a sandbox account. So we'll be putting a link out there in just a second that will actually go through the process of telling you, hey, here's how you can create an AWS account. You'll need to have that, and you'll also need to have the AWS CLI installed and configured. And I'll talk through some of that in just a minute. Again, we'll provide links for that so you know exactly how you can get that set up and running. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you here really quick that if we go to the page, the actual GitHub repository that I have set up for this episode tonight, you can see that if I scroll down here and I scroll all the way down to prerequisites, these links are also included here, as well as the links for each of the tools that I'll be covering that we'll be installing here in just a minute. So this is also there. So again, don't feel like you have to sit here and feverishly take notes. I've tried to document what I can in the README on the GitHub repository, so you should be able to do that and kind of hit the ground running from there. Okay, so now that we're to this point, we're gonna get started. We're gonna dive in. Now, I'm gonna tell you that on purpose here, I'm gonna be doing most everything from the command line and not from the console. Now, part of the reason for that is there are some complications that come in working with EKS from the console and the command line. If you're not using the same user for both, that's a whole other story. We won't dive into that right now. But in part of making this easier, I just want to have you be able to do things in one place. And when you're dealing with Kubernetes, a vast majority of what you're going to be doing is going to happen in the command line. So we're just going to kind of start there. So let me go ahead and pull up the command line here. We open this back up. 1 second. Here we go. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of work here to make sure that we've properly set up the machine that we're working on here. So I'm going to go ahead and run AWS version. You can see here that I am running the latest version of the AWS CLI, or at least pretty close to the latest version. I don't think I updated this right before this episode, but it'll be pretty close. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run another command here, which is going to just show me that I have a list of buckets, which the only reason I'm doing this is I'm showing you that, hey, I actually have an AWS account that is configured with my AWS CLI. And you can follow the link that I mentioned earlier if you need to learn how to actually do that. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to run another command that's called EKSCTL version. Now, I'm not going to run this one and execute it just yet because I want to call out that we need to install something. So what we need to install is a utility called EKSCTL or EKS control. Now, this is a great utility. It actually wasn't developed initially by AWS, but they actually have now included it in with the documentation. It is a super easy way to set up your EKS clusters and manage them without having to go through and execute a huge long string of different commands on AWS. So let me give you an example. If you were setting up your own EKS cluster, what you would need to do is you would need to go in and do things like set up multiple IAM roles, one for your cluster, one for your nodes to communicate to your cluster. You would need to go and launch your cluster. You then would need to separately launch and configure, a node group that actually knows how to communicate with the cluster. There's a lot of steps involved. And again, the goal here tonight is not for you to understand every single bit of Kubernetes. It's to go in and be able to get this working. And that's what I want to show you how to do. And so EKSCTL becomes a great way to do this. And so you can go through here and you'll be able to see how you install it, whether you're on Mac, Linux, or Windows. I'm on Mac and I have utilized Homebrew to install it locally. And so you can see that I actually have installed it because when I run EKSCTL version, you can actually see I'm getting a version number back. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is I'm also going to check and make sure that I have a kubectl. So kube control, kube cuddle, everybody calls it something different, but this is the official command line tool for Kubernetes. Now, just as before, I've included some documentation here, also referencing the AWS documentation for how you get this installed. And it's important to note here, this isn't going to work for you until you have a config file that actually is for your EKS cluster that you've launched. So I'll show you how we actually generate that in a bit. And then the last one is we're going to use a tool called K9s or K9s, and I also have installed this via Homebrew, but you can see the link here. This is going to let us really inspect our cluster without having to memorize a huge, massive amount of kubectl commands that we would need to know. So with that being said, let's go ahead and check these things. Let me be sure I have all of them installed. So kubectl version, we can see here that it's returning some information. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check and be sure that, actually I don't have to check and be sure that I have K9s installed because I've actually got that set up in another tab. We'll get to that in just a second. But with that being said, we're now ready to dive in and start building out our cluster. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up VS Code. And here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and create a new file. We're going to call this cluster.yml. It's a YAML-based file. Now, what we need to do here for EKS-CTL is we need to give it some values so it knows actually how to, one second here. So it actually knows how to go in, and sorry, I wasn't showing the screen there for just a second, but I've created this file here, cluster.yml, and we're going to define some things that we need to define for our given cluster. So what I want to do first is I want to go in here and first specify that the API version, and you'll see this throughout all the different YAML definition files that we have, is that it just specifies, again, the version of the API that we'll be using to execute the command or to basically apply the object that we're creating. In this case, this is going to be consumed by EKS-CTL and not by the Kubernetes cluster itself. And this is a cluster config, so that's what we want to do here. We need to give it a few bits of information so it knows how to create our cluster. So I've got some metadata that I'm going to add in. Here, this is going to be a CBL cluster, and US East 2 is going to be the region that I'm going to deploy this into. So again, we just have this one file so far. We've just defined some basic information and some metadata. There's one additional thing that we need to define here. This would actually be enough to set up our cluster, but we also want to define a node group. Now, if you remember from what I talked about earlier, a node group is going to be the nodes that our applications that we deploy are actually going to run on. So here we're going to have one node group, and within it, it's going to have 3 different instances. Now, I've specified here a name for this group, which is going to be CBL node group. I'm also specifying here that the instance type is going to be T3 micro. Now, part of the reason I'm doing this for your benefit, again, is that this is included on the free tier. So you'll be able to take advantage of this without paying, as much. But again, even if you were to use larger instances, as long as you spin these up and then spin them back down when you're done, you won't have huge costs, but you do need to be cognizant of this. I've also included a link inside of the GitHub README file that if you don't know how to set up budget alarms for your AWS account, I've included a link to a video from ACG that will walk you through exactly that. So now that we've defined this, we're going to say here that our desired capacity is 3. That means we're going to have 3 instances that spin up in EC2. We're going to set the volume size to be 10, and we're going to specify here that we don't need to SSH into these specific ones, then we're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to basically just hit save for that. I'm going to go back to the terminal, and here within the terminal, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another command that I would need to run called EKS-CTL and create cluster, and then I pass in the file that we just created, which again is a pretty simple file overall. We're just having to specify a few things in there. Now, here's the catch, right? If I were to execute this command right now, it would take about 15 minutes for it to run from beginning to end. Now, I really hate doing smoke and mirrors in Cloud Builder Live. I want you to see everything, but I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, because I didn't want to have to just sit here and stall for 15 minutes, I went ahead and ran this command a little bit earlier this afternoon. So if I go look here in this second tab, you can actually see the output of this command. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this back up on screen so that you can see it. First, you can see here that it went through and it's basically setting the availability zones. It says it's going to create a cluster, and it's waiting for this cluster to finish. Now, it's actually deploying this utilizing CloudFormation. And so you could go through in CloudFormation and follow along with this creation process. It then goes through and it waits for that to complete, and then it creates a node group that goes along with this. And so it's going to go through and wait for those to be configured. And then here's the other thing I want to point out is it actually creates our kube config and actually stores that locally. So because it stores that locally, we can now interact with our cluster utilizing any of the normal Kubernetes command line tools like kubectl. We also will be able to utilize K9s. So if I go back here, I'm going to cancel out of this because I'm not going to execute that command. But if I call another command, kubectl get nodes, we can see here that it returns 3 different nodes because we told it, hey, go ahead and launch 3 different nodes for our node group. So that gets completed that got completed the way that we needed it to. So that's great. So with that being said, now that we have that in place, we're now ready to start the process of actually deploying something. So let me go ahead and show you one other thing here back on my browser. So I'm going to pull this up. I have another GitHub repository, and if you followed along with Cloud Builder Live, I've used this before. I just have a sample API that what it does is it fetches data about COVID in terms of like infection rates and the like. And it's from a place called Our World in Data. They've made this data available for free. And so I've actually created an API that will basically just go in and query that data. So this is a very simple kind of just think of this as just a simple microservice that needs to get deployed. And so this is what we're going to actually deploy. Now, I'm actually going to use the package repository here in GitHub. So I can actually look this up. You can see here that I'm actually utilizing this, and I've got a specific hash here that we're going to be utilizing so I can get this exact version and deploy this out to Kubernetes. So let me go ahead and go back over here to, actually, I'm going to go to VS Code. So now that we've created our cluster, the next thing that we need to create is I need to actually create a deployment. So we're going to create a deployment. So here I'm going to call this one deployment.yml. And what I need to do is I need to go in here and pass in some information just like we did when we created our cluster config. But if you've had any experience with Kubernetes, this will start to look a little bit more familiar. So in this case, we're going to say that we're creating a deployment, and we're going to just specify apps v1 for the API version. Now, after this, we're going to need to pass in some metadata. So we're going to give this the name of COVID API deployment, and we're going to specify here that the label for what we're deploying is going to be COVID API. Now, this is important because we'll see this show up a few other times, especially when we're configuring our service. So now the next thing I need to do is I need to pass in the spec, and this is going to have a lot of information. So we're just going to break this down piece by piece. So don't get freaked out here by the length of that. So first of all, we're going to specify here again that this is going to have 3 replicas. That means that we're actually going to deploy this application basically 3 times onto those nodes. And in a bit, when we create a service, we'll actually go in and be able to utilize the process of using a load balancer, which actually will use Elastic Load Balancer to actually access those through that load balancer. We're going to specify here that we're going to use the label here of COVID API, and we're going to give this a name of COVID API, and we're going to specify the image that I mentioned earlier. So this is going to utilize GitHub as the container repository to actually then we'll pull from when we deploy our application. And here we're also specifying here that the container port is 8080 because that's what I configured for that COVID API that we looked at earlier. Perfect. So now that we've done that, we're now ready to see if we can deploy to our newly created EKS cluster in AWS, okay? So I'm going to go back over here to the terminal, and I'm gonna just basically say that I want kubectl to apply this. We're gonna apply our deployment.yml file. So now I'm gonna go ahead and hit enter. Now it's gonna go ahead and start the process. It's saying it has created the deployment. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to another tab, and I'm going to launch K9s. Now, this is a great tool for managing from the command line, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit about how to leverage it. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to hit : and then type in deploy, and I can see that deployment comes up. I can just hit tab and then enter, and it's going to show me the different deployments that I have here in the system. And I can see that it's already done one for core DNS. And again, that's just a part of what gets launched with EKS. But I can see here that my deployment for COVID API, that actually was successful. I can see that 3 of 3 are ready. If I hit the D key, it will go in and give me more information here about this deployment. So I can see here that, again, 3 were desired, 3 have been updated, and there are 3 total. And it even goes through and talks about what the update strategy is. It references the container that I deployed, all of those things. So great. So what I can do here is I'm now going to hit escape, and I'm going to hit colon again, and I'm going to type in pods. And here I can see all of the pods. Now, it's showing me ones, even the system ones that have been deployed. So if I hit number 1, it's just going to show me just the ones that I've done. So I can see here my 3 different pods that have been deployed from our previous deployment. But here's the thing. When I look at the IP address that's included, those are just local IP addresses. So even though we've created this, even though we have it up and running, what we don't have yet is that we need to actually expose this. Because like I said, our goal here was that we want to be able to go through the process of exposing this so we can actually call this as an API. Okay, so here's how we're going to do that. We're going to create a service that is going to take our deployed application, which is a pod, and is going to make it available, and it's actually going to route it through a load balancer. Now, again, because we're dealing with AWS, this is going to utilize an Elastic load balancer. Now, I'm purposefully just showing you how to expose via HTTP. You can absolutely expose via HTTPS, but that's going to take some extra steps, and you're going to have to do some AWS specific annotations in your service definition, and there's plenty of documentation on how to do that. But that would be some extra steps. And again, I'm just trying to get you working with Kubernetes and make sure that you understand how that works. So let's go ahead and dive back in and look at how we will go through the process of creating a service. So I'm going to go back to VS Code. And here within VS Code, I'm going to create another new file. I'm going to call this one service.yml. And then within here, just like the others, we need to add in some information. So first, we're going to say, hey, we're doing a service here. We're going to use API version of v1. The next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to give it metadata. I'm going to call this COVID API service. And then I'm going to need to pass in the spec. Now, this spec, thankfully, is not as long as our last one. So what we're saying here is, basically, we want you to go out and find things that have that app of COVID API. We want to be able to expose this via TCP. Oh, and this actually should be port 80, not port 443. And we're saying that we want it to expose the target port of 8080. And that, again, is the target port for the application that we deployed. And we're also going to specify here that this is a type of load balancer, because if you remember, we have 3 different, in essence, versions of this that are out there running, and we want it to be able to load balance between the different options. So now that I have that saved, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back over here to the terminal. I'm going to go back to my first tab that I have open here, and we're actually going to run a command where we apply this particular file, which is service.yaml. Now, it's going to go through the process here of saying, hey, we've created a service. And so what I want to do now is I actually want to go back over to my K9s tab, and I want to look in here. I'm going to hit colon and then type in service, and I'm going to hit enter. Now, I can see here that I now have a COVID API service defined. If I hit D, which will describe it, I can see that I now have a load balancer ingress. Now, I'll tell you this right off the bat, it's probably going to take it like another minute or 2 for it to actually, for this DNS to properly resolve to the to our endpoint here. So what I want to do for just a second is I want to see, are there any questions that you have about what we've done so far, the tools we've leveraged, why you would or wouldn't use Kubernetes, any of those kind of things. Be sure to enter those questions in. I'm going to take a sip of coffee, and then in just a second, we're going to check and make sure that our API is actually running. And for those of you keeping track at home, yes, here in the US, it probably is a bit too late for me to actually be drinking coffee, but yet here we are. So, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this host name for load balancer ingress. And again, keep those questions coming. I'm going to get to those, but I want to be sure you had a chance to start typing those in. And I'm going to load back up the browser and just go to a new tab. And we can see here that we have landed at Hello World. So that actually is what we should see for just the base endpoint. Now, I don't want you to just assume everything's working great. So I want to show you that I also have here a set of tests that I can run against this API that will make sure that it's working properly. So all I need to do is I need to update the host name. And once I update this host name, I should be able to just hit save. And I should be able to go back and run these tests. And I can see that they all actually work correctly, right? They've actually gone through the process. And so we have been able to successfully deploy this out and actually expose it via a service. And we've verified that it does actually work properly. And so I could even go in and look at one of these and I can see all the data here that gets returned. In this case, you can see the list of all of the countries that are included with the data. So it is properly returning that, it's properly working, and we can see that it's actually load balancing between them. So if I were to go in and look, for example, you can see here, again, under describe with K9s, I can see here that it's actually pointing to the 3 different endpoints that actually exist for this one service that we actually have deployed. So this is showing you, yes, indeed, this is working through an Elastic load balancer to enable us to be able to do this. Now, I see that there's a question that somebody has here that says, hey, so we don't have to configure any load balancer manually. So you can still utilize Kubernetes as you would. You could utilize the different Kubernetes approaches for load balancing that you want to use, but with EKS by default, and again, this is where I mentioned that you need to understand a little bit about AWS and Kubernetes to properly use EKS. It's going to utilize an Elastic load balancer, which is a service from AWS. It's going to utilize that for load balancing by default. So if you set type load balancer within your service definition, then it will use Elastic load balancing. Now, again, that doesn't mean you can't go through and configure things a different way within Kubernetes. You could really try to make it as purely Kubernetes as possible and try to avoid some of these AWS specific integrations. Or you could say, you know what, I just want to utilize EKS as much as the way AWS created it as possible and choose to leverage these types of services. But again, that is a great question. And that is, again, this is where it's a bit of a struggle. And I'll also be honest with you on this. I don't even think that AWS is the easiest way, the easiest of the cloud providers to run Kubernetes. But again, you get the advantage of being able to have access to all of the different managed services that AWS provides. And so if you want to use Kubernetes alongside something like DynamoDB, right? Or if you want to use it, alongside S3 for storage, there's all of these options. There's a great compelling reason to utilize EKS if you want to run Kubernetes in the cloud. But you do need to understand you're going to have to learn kind of what this balance is between things that are very AWS specific and things that are Kubernetes specific. Okay? Any other questions before I dive back in? Time for another sip of coffee. Okay. So let me go ahead and pull this back up. Now that we've created this and we've created our cluster, right? I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to be sure that you knew not only how to actually pass this. Oh, and I see that somebody just mentioned here that I help them pass their cloud practitioner exam. Awesome. I am very proud of you for going through and taking that exam and passing it. That is an awesome first step in AWS. So congrats on that. But I wanted to show you here not only how we deploy our Kubernetes cluster, but as I mentioned, it's actually really important to also be able to delete your Kubernetes cluster. So here we can see that EKS CTL also provides a way for us to go in and not only create, but also delete our clusters. So here, I'm going to run a command here, and really all I need to do is I need to go through and specify that I want it to delete a cluster, pass in the name, and pass in the region, which in this case is going to be the region that we mentioned earlier, US East 2. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this command, and we'll see that it's going to go through the process here of, first, it's going to say it's going to be draining these node groups, and it's going to go through the process of dealing with taking these nodes offline before eventually going through and actually taking the entire cluster offline. Now, you could go through and watch this for the most part and interact with a lot of what I've done. You could do it in the console. So thankfully, this has only been, it's been less than a year ago, I think maybe just 3 or 4 months ago, AWS added in the ability to take all of the major kind of data types within Kubernetes, and you can see them in the console. So things like, again, deployments, pods, services, the kind of things that we've talked about so far. So you might ask, well, why didn't I utilize the console? As I mentioned earlier, when you're working within Kubernetes, so much of what you're going to be doing is going to need to happen in the command line. So I wanted to be sure you had a level of experience with that. And this is one of those situations where sometimes working in the command line can actually be easier over the steps that you would need to follow if you're doing it within the console. And there's a couple reasons why there's some challenges with that and why some of you might hit a couple roadblocks. So I wanted to be sure you saw how we could utilize EKS-CTL to make this process of creating our cluster as easy as possible. Now, just to quickly review what we've done so far is, first of all, I'm going to go back here to VS Code. And really here, we've been able to do all of this by just creating 3 different files. We first created our cluster definition, which again is very specific to EKS-CTL. It shows us how we can go through the process of creating both a cluster, and that's what we've done here with our cluster configuration and this metadata, and to create a node group, which in this case is going to launch 3 different T3 micro instances on EC2. Then after this, we actually deployed an existing container that we had. And you can see here that you don't have to just use the Elastic Container Registry or ECR on AWS. If you want to use Docker Hub, go ahead. If you want to utilize GitHub like I did, obviously that's an option as well. So you can utilize whatever one you choose. Now, with this being said, I also have specified here that we're exposing a port, we've given it a name, and then we created our service definition and mentioned that it was a type of load balancer, and this is what enables us to take advantage of this built-in AWS capability with Elastic Load Balancer to actually deploy our pod that we actually have deployed, to deploy it as a service and make it available for our users on port 80 over HTTP. Now, if we go back and check here, we can see that it's waiting for these CloudFormation stacks to be destroyed. And so we've done the whole process here of cleaning it up. And I mentioned again, this is super critical because in this case, we'd be paying first. We have a flat fee that we have to pay for the control plane that gets launched with EKS. And then on top of that, we would actually be paying for 3 different instances that are running in EC2. Now, I did choose things that actually were available within the free tier, so it shouldn't cause you a huge amount of trouble, but you do want to be sure that you're deleting the infrastructure that we've created so far. So as we're kind of wrapping things up here, have we been able to accomplish our goal? I think we have. Remember, the goal here was that we wanted to be able to fully deploy an HTTP API microservice using K8s, and we wanted to do it utilizing the Elastic Kubernetes Service on AWS. We wanted to verify that it was accessible via HTTP as a public endpoint. I think we've been able to accomplish that. So I wanted to give another moment here to see if there are any questions for what we've been able to accomplish so far during this episode. The next thing I want to mention as you guys are thinking about questions is we are always looking for new ideas on what you want to see covered here on Cloud Builder Live. So if you have a topic either on AWS, Azure, or GCP that you want to see us dive into, you can go through, you could enter it into the chat right now. You also could, message it, send it across via Twitter. You could go on to the Discord for Pluralsight and enter it there. Whatever method you have to communicate with us, we want to be able to make sure that we're getting ideas from you about what you want to see covered. So I see Okay, there's one question here about what about using encrypted protocols? So let's talk really quickly because this is a great question. I alluded to this briefly, but let's say you want to actually expose this endpoint as, HTTPS. Let's just use this as the kind of the most basic of encrypted protocols that we're looking at here. So if you want to do this, you can, but you do need to understand some things if you're using the load balancer provided by AWS through EKS, which is Elastic Load Balancer. That also means you will need to configure a certificate with the certificate manager, the AWS certificate manager, ACM. So you would then go through and first create your certificate, and then you would have some very specific annotations that would go in your service definition that are AWS specific annotations that let it know that you want to expose HTTPS, that let it know what the ARN is for your certificate that you've created in ACM. And then you would go through and reapply that. Then you would have it be available via that load balancer. You would be able to get HTTPS. It is totally doable, but there are some extra steps involved because now you need to learn how ACM works and how to properly get that certificate created for you. And then you need to know how to put those annotations into your service definition. So he says here, the next comment I see here is, would I need experience in Linux for AWS Associate? So question on that, because there are three different AWS Associate exams. We have Developer, Architect, and then SysOps Associate. All three of those are available. I'm going to assume here that you're talking about SysOps Associate. And in that case, I don't believe, because I took the exam when it was in beta, maybe about 8 months ago, and I don't believe you needed any direct Linux experience for that. Now, I could be wrong. Somebody else can feel free to put notes in there, but I don't remember that was a part of what was covered. But that is a great question as well. But do note that with that exam, if you take it now, you actually do have those interactive lab portions that you have to complete. It's not just questions. So the question here is, would you be able to do a deep dive showing the process of incorporating ACM and certs on the load balancer in another session? So with this, that's a great note. We can certainly dive in and do that at some point. If we can't for one reason or another, if that doesn't fit into another episode, I can just do that on my blog for you and do a video walkthrough of that as well. So be following me on Twitter _DavidTucker_, as well as both Pluralsight and A Cloud Guru, to be sure you're getting information, and I will post out where I will put that, because I know that's a question, that's something you want to figure out how to do. So I'll make sure that we get that in place. Next, what about Associate Architect? I also don't think you need Linux experience for that. That's not something that's covered on that side of it, but you do need to understand, especially how AWS services work together and how they're configured together. That's a huge part of that Associate Architect exam. So that would be something I would thoroughly consider with that. Do I have recommendations for logging? Oh, goodness. There's so much with this. You can utilize the AWS native service CloudWatch for logging with EKS. I am somebody who I generally believe that if you have the ability to utilize a service that's managed for you, you should do that before you go through the process of trying to roll out something custom or something that you're going to have to own and maintain. So there's a couple different annotations that you need to put in as well when you create your cluster so that you can go in and actually do logging. Now, I could go in and look, and I could show you. We also can, if we just want to do like some debug logging, I can actually look at logs directly within K9s right now, but I wouldn't be able to go in and see them in CloudWatch because I didn't configure that. With just a little bit of work in configuring your cluster, you can configure it to also send those logs to CloudWatch. And CloudWatch is a service, again, that's going to be fully managed for you. You're not going to have to worry about it. You're not going to have to deploy updates to CloudWatch, any of those kinds of things. So I would say start there. If you want to look at other options after that, sure, absolutely go ahead. There's a ton of great options for Kubernetes that you can utilize for that. But again, CloudWatch is a fully managed service. You do just need to understand that obviously you have to pay for CloudWatch for how much you use it. And so if you see that the cost structure doesn't fit what you want to do with logging, then you also can look at something else. Okay, so he says let me read this question. I use client max body size in Nginx for controlling file size upload/download when using it as a reverse proxy. Can we do something similar with Elastic Load Balancer? So in this case, no, you can't do that. But as I mentioned, you don't have to utilize Elastic Load Balancer, right? You could choose to roll your own and not utilize that managed service, but knowing, just as I just mentioned, in doing so, you're going to have the ability then of, having to own and maintain that as you move forward. But that, again, that's a great question. I feel like utilize the native services whenever you can, but the moment your needs go beyond that, that's when you start to look at what you could leverage that's more custom in nature, even if you're going to have to own and maintain that kind of over the life of the application. But again, these are phenomenal questions. I'm loving these questions you guys have. So as we kind of wrap things up here, are there any other questions that you have? Okay, I'm not seeing any come through. So listen, thank you all for joining me for Cloud Builder Live here for this August 2022 episode for deploying your first microservice on Kubernetes with AWS. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope you take time to go through the GitHub repository and you actually get a chance to do this yourself. Let us know in Discord or on Twitter what your experience is. Let me know if you have any hiccups as you go through the process. And again, be sure you're coming back next month to see what we're covering next here on Cloud Builder Live for Pluralsight and a Cloud Guru.